Hey heroes, and welcome to another insidious episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is sponsored in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to contribute and vote in monthly polls that help decide what topics get covered on the channel, then you can sign up for an event of your choosing over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me. One notable event that we've mentioned multiple times on the channel before is an incident in which a deadly vigilante calling himself the Scourge of the Underworld launched an infamous attack on the supervillain saloon known as the Bar with No Name, resulting in the deaths of 18 costumed criminals. We've talked about the origins of some of these victims in previous videos, but for this week, let's go back to that particular well and discuss a few more of these C-list supervillains. Although for some of these, C-list might be giving them more credit than they deserve. For our first masked ne'er-do-well, we turn our attention towards a businessman named Howard Mitchell, who owned his own company that specialized in transporting valuable cargo with armored vehicles. At some point in his life, Mitchell spent time in the jungles of Peru and learned how to produce a form of amnesia-inducing knockout gas. And so when his business began to decline, he used this gas as well as other weapons and equipment he'd gathered to start hijacking his own company's shipments and steal from his own clients. Protecting both himself and his identity with a bulky gas mask, Mitchell's alter ego was dubbed the Hijacker by the news media. However, his crime spree came to a quick end when the original Ant-Man, Hank Pym, deduced the Hijacker's true identity and swiftly defeated him. After serving some time in prison, the Hijacker later resurfaced, this time with a sizable armored vehicle called the Crime Tank, better known as the Murder Machine. Immediately returning to crime, he attempted to steal valuable prototypes from a Stark Industries facility on the West Coast, but this scheme was quickly thwarted by Hank Pym's size-changing associate, Bill Foster, known at the time as Black Goliath, as well as the Thing himself, Ben Grimm of the Fantastic Four. Suffice it to say, neither the Hijacker nor his murder machine were a match for these two heroes. Some months after that, Mitchell attempted to take revenge on the Thing, who was recuperating in the hospital after an unrelated incident. However, his rebuilt murder machine was demolished by Iron Man before he could even come close to his target. Sometime after that, when a former supervillain named Gary Gilbert invited a number of costume criminals to an Ohio-based branch of the Bar with No Name, the Hijacker was among those who attended to discuss the danger posed to their community by the Scourge of the Underworld, and thus was one of those killed when the meeting was infiltrated and attacked by Scourge himself, who impersonated their bartender Jake. A number of years later, the Hijacker was also among the villains who were resurrected in a mystic ritual performed by the aspiring crime lord Parker Robbins, also known as the Hood, as part of a scheme to take down another brutal vigilante, Frank Castle, the Punisher. Finally ready to prove himself, the Hijacker rebuilt his murder machine and redesigned his costume and equipment to include a variety of different gases. He and several other resurrected goons, colloquially referred to as the Dirty Dozen, launched their attack on the Punisher. However, Frank was able to use a dose of size-changing Pym particles to infiltrate and seize control of the Crime Tank, using it against the Hijacker's allies and rescuing their captive, a former S.H.I.E.L.D. agent named G.W. Bridge. The Hijacker somehow survived that whole situation and resurfaced a few months later, using his murder machine in a series of bank robberies. In his reckless rampage, he ran over and killed several individuals, including a security guard and at least 2 civilians, one of whom was a child, before he was subdued by Venom in a particularly brutal fashion and ultimately killed. All in all, it was a rather undignified end, which is perhaps befitting a man who might just be one of the least successful supervillains in the entire Marvel Universe. For our next tale, we turn our attention towards a high iron construction site run by a man named Maxwell Plum. Now, among Plum's employees on this job, there were a trio of brothers, the Mallards, but one day there was a tragic accident in which two of the three fell to their doom. Blaming their boss for his substandard safety practices, the surviving brother, Jake Mallard, created the costumed identity of Steeplejack and swore revenge. Mallard tried to kill Plum by throwing him from the unfinished building as well, but this murder attempt was thwarted by the bulletproof hero Luke Cage, aka Power Man. Now, while Steeplejack's indignation with his boss might have been justified, he was also pretty racist, repeatedly calling Luke boy, much to the hero's annoyance. Furthermore, although his costume was peculiar, Mallard did outfit himself with a modified rivet gun that could fire red-hot ammunition with considerable force, as well as an oversized acetylene flame. He was also pretty darn strong and succeeded in tossing Power Man around in their initial encounter. All that really accomplished, however, was pushing the hero to inadvertently unleash more of his strength than he normally would on a non-powered opponent. As a result, the tank of flammable liquid that Steeplejack wore on his back ruptured before the villain fell from the construction site and perished in an explosion. In the wake of that incident, work on Maxwell Plum's construction site continued until another man, Joe Danvers, discovered Plum's unsafe practices and intended on blowing the whistle on the whole shoddy operation. In an attempt to silence Danvers, Plum stole the designs for Mallard's equipment, using them to become the second Steeplejack. Of course, the flaw in Plum's plan was that Joe Danvers' daughter, Carol, was secretly a half-alien superhero known at the time as Ms. Marvel. Suffice it to say, Maxwell Plum was defeated in the ensuing battle and his schemes were exposed. He was later one of the costumed villains to be slain by the Scourge of the Underworld, and unlike many of their contemporaries, both Steeplejacks have thus far stayed dead. The closest thing they've had to a legacy came years later when Roderick Kingsley, the original Hobgoblin, operated a business in which he franchised out defunct supervillain identities and equipment to petty criminals. One of these new Steeplejacks was killed in a conflict between Kingsley's forces and Norman Osborn's Goblin Nation, but another was later seen wearing a version of Jake Mallard's original costume. Although in the end, these men are little more than nameless crooks who were bamboozled by a legitimate villain into adopting an identity that has no real value. Next, let's turn our attention to a man named Denton Phelps. Born and raised in Flagstaff, Arizona, Phelps was a bully from a young age. During his teenage years, he was his high school's star football player, and while he excelled in shop class, his other grades were so lackluster that he ended up being removed from the team and subsequently dropped out of school entirely. After attacking some of his former classmates for mocking him, Denton Phelps spent about a year in prison before deciding to embark on a criminal career. As such, he designed his own costume as well as a pair of wrist-mounted weapons that could fire razor-sharp projectiles, and dubbed himself Hellrazor. Meanwhile, as part of a larger plot to steal Wakandan vibranium, the notoriously corrupt Roxxon Corporation had one of their business partners, Thomas Agar, sell the African nation roughly $500 million worth of tungsten, and then fail to deliver. Hellrazor was then hired to impersonate the Black Panther and publicly abduct Agar, thereby discrediting the Wakandan ruler. However, this scheme was ultimately thwarted by Spider-Man and the real Black Panther. Interestingly, in this battle, Hellrazor demonstrated what he called kinetosynthetic powers, allowing him to absorb kinetic energy to replenish his stamina and grant himself a measure of superhuman strength, although the source of this ability was never revealed. The Roxxon Corporation is known to have endowed their agents with superhuman powers, but given what little we know of Hellrazor's history, it's certainly possible that he was always this way, but Either way, it's just speculation. In any event, his kinetic absorption abilities were far more limited than those of, say, Sebastian Shaw, for example, and Hellrazor was no match for Spider-Man and the Black Panther. Wakanda was refunded the money that they paid to Agar Ors, and Thomas Agar himself took the fall for the phony kidnapping. Of course, as usual, the Roxxon Corporation avoided any negative press or culpability in the whole affair. A few years after that incident, Hellrazor attended the supervillain meeting at Ohio's bar with no name, but was embarrassed to find that nobody else there had ever even heard of him. And of course, he also went down in a hail of bullets unleashed by the scourge of the underworld, bringing his short-lived criminal career to an ignominious end. Now, years later, there was another criminal who used the same name to run a protection racket in Billings, Montana, only to be quickly arrested by Norman Osborn's Thunderbolts team. Furthermore, after only 2 days in prison, this new Hellrazor was badly beaten, maybe even to death considering we never see him again, by the former teen hero Robbie Baldwin, originally Speedball but known at the time as Penance. Now, Robbie's story is a whole other rabbit hole, so for now we'll just point out that thus far nobody using the name Hellrazor has had anything resembling a successful supervillain career. For our next villain, we turn our attention to an unidentified man who survived growing up in a West Coast ghetto by learning to grapple with his larger opponents. Wanting to get ahead in life, he sought out billionaire Hugh Howard, accosting him as he exited his Las Vegas casino. When the man asked Howard the secrets of success, the billionaire simply said, "Leverage," while his bodyguards dragged the poor man away and gave him a beating for his troubles. Clearly taking the advice more literally than intended, the poor man began studying the science of leverage, applying it in his mastery of martial arts. After earning money from championship tournaments, he next studied the world of finance, determined to fully master anything and everything related to leverage. This mad quest culminated in him taking everything he'd learned and using it to craft the masked identity of the Grappler for some reason. He designed a special computer pack that could calculate physics on the fly, allowing him to perform admittedly impressive feats like flipping a moving armored car with his titanium steel staff. Of course, he was no match for the savage She-Hulk, who defeated him on more than one occasion. The Grappler was subsequently one of Scourge's many victims, but unlike many of the others, nobody ever bothered to resurrect or even remember him. Next, we turn our attention to a man named Eric Geldon, better known as the international criminal Mindwave. Armed with telepathic powers and high-tech weaponry, Mindwave was initially active in Europe, where he clashed with the famous mentalist Uri Geller. He and his henchmen, the Espertees, subsequently launched an attack on Wall Street with a heavily armored vehicle called the Think Tank. However, Uri Geller pursued Mindwave to New York and joined forces with Daredevil to stop him, and in the end Mindwave's telepathy proved no match for Geller's psionic abilities. And then Eric Geldon was among those killed by Scourge at the bar with no name. Some years later, a different individual adopted the name Mindwave, although he intentionally spelled the name without the hyphen to differentiate himself from his predecessor. Really not much is known about this second Mindwave, however he did seem to possess considerable telekinetic power that the original lacked. After launching an attack on a police station in Las Vegas, this Mindwave surrendered to Norman Osborn's Thunderbolts and allowed himself to be imprisoned in their mountain headquarters. However, this was part of a scheme he'd concocted with 3 other captive telepaths to combine their powers and mentally take down the Thunderbolts from the inside. This plan nearly worked as they psionically compelled the Thunderbolts to turn on each other and their support staff, but their scheme came to an abrupt end when all 4 telepaths were killed by Bullseye. Not too long after that, the original Mindwave was among the villains to be mystically resurrected by the Hood. He and several others launched an attack on the Punisher while another villain, Mirage, used his illusion-casting abilities to disguise them as the Avengers. However, Castle saw through this ruse, in part because the roster they impersonated was outdated during this time, and in the end Mindwave was fatally shot and his body booby-trapped with an explosive device that detonated when several other villains investigated. Maybe the Hood would have been better off resurrecting the other Mindwave, since he was undoubtedly the more formidable of the two. Now, for our next story, you may recall from a previous video that millennia ago the alien race known as the Kree left one of their Sentry robots on Earth to observe the development of the Inhumans. This machine, identified as Sentry number 459, remained hidden for thousands of years, but early in the Marvel Age, its outpost was found by the noted archaeologist Dr. Daniel Damian, and the Sentry subsequently clashed with the Fantastic Four when they responded to Damian's distress signal. That conflict drew the attention of the Kree themselves and their supreme public accuser, Ronan, who tasked the crew of the starship Hellion, commanded by Colonel Jan Rog, with infiltrating and observing the Earth. Of course, the most notable crewman on that exploratory mission was the Kree war hero Captain Mar-Vell, who ended up allying himself with Earth's superhuman champions, much to the dismay of his superiors. But I digress. The important thing for today is that after more conflicts involving Mar-Vell, Ronan, and the Avengers, Sentry number 459 was retrieved by Kree scientists Tara and Mac Ron, who began erasing its seemingly faulty programming. However, their vessel was detected by the S.H.I.E.L.D. helicarrier, and a trigger-happy agent shot the alien starship down before it could leave Earth's atmosphere. The Sentry fell from the vessel and landed just outside Mexico City, where it was found by a local outlaw named Raul Echeverria. Already primed for reprogramming, the Sentry absorbed and duplicated the outlaw's brain patterns to restore its own mechanical mind. However, Echeverria's enmity with the authorities caused the alien machine to go on a rampage. This incident seemingly came to an abrupt end with the arrival of Captain Mar-Vell, but then the Sentry fired a beam of enigmatic energy into the city, which sought out and struck Echeverria's partner in crime, a thief by the name of Esteban Caracas. This alien energy beam mutated Caracas, transforming him into a furry superhuman with razor-sharp claws. Calling himself the Cheetah, Caracas joined forces with the Kree Sentry, and the two traveled north into Texas, where they launched attacks on American factories, since both Caracas and Echeverria resented American capitalists for exploiting and oppressing the people of Mexico. They were opposed by Captain Mar-Vell, but the Cheetah's newfound power served him surprisingly well, and with help from the Sentry, he actually managed to defeat the Kree hero in their first encounter. Not long after that, however, they were caught up in a battle between Mar-Vell and Ronan, during which Sentry number 459 was smashed into pieces, which in turn caused the Cheetah to revert back to human form. Now, unlike some villains we talked about today, it seems like the Cheetah could have been a contender given his impressive strength and understandable indignation towards the United States, but after losing his powers, he apparently became an unremarkable costumed criminal with no notable exploits. He was present at the bar with no name during Scourge's infamous attack, and ended up just another body in the pile. Weirdly enough, however, the Cheetah's remains were used by other villains on more than one occasion. In one instance, there was a mutant named Lou Dexter, better known as Dead Ringer, who could mimic the form, abilities, and even equipment of any dead person simply by touching a piece of their corpse. As such, he built up his repertoire by harvesting fingers from dead supervillains, including the Cheetahs, keeping them in a cigar box. He used this ability in a scheme to discredit Captain America by staging fights in which his partner in crime, Mike Farrell, aka the Super Patriot, impersonated Cap while failing to protect civilian onlookers. In one such encounter, Dexter took on the Cheetah's form while battling the imposter Cap at a fast food restaurant in Pennsylvania. But that phony fight came to a painful end when an employee dumped a vat of boiling liquid onto the fake Cheetah. In another incident, the Cheetah's DNA, along with that of numerous others, was harvested by the notorious Arnim Zola, who used these samples to create a legion of costumed henchmen called the Corpse Corps. However, these duplicates of dead supervillains, referred to as proto-husks, were far less sophisticated than properly grown clones, and were ultimately wiped out by Deadpool. The Cheetah's corpse was ultimately obtained by the Hood, who resurrected him along with numerous other dead villains, but he seems to have been among those who were killed by the Punisher soon thereafter. For our final story of the day, we turn our attention towards a villain who is more of a legitimate threat, the Psycho Man. Originating from the seemingly subatomic microverse, the Psycho Man wielded an emotion-manipulating control box and sought to conquer the Earth. In his first attempt to do so, he recruited several human criminals to serve him, outfitting 3 individuals with specialized equipment. Gary Busser was given a multi-purpose shock blaster gun that could fire different types of ammunition, including regular bullets and guided hunter missiles, and became known as Shell Shock. Rance Preston was given an electro lariat and took the name Live Wire. Ivan Karlovich was armed with a solar ray gun, but for some reason he didn't get a code name. This trio helped Psycho Man obtain the parts he needed to construct a larger version of his control box that could operate on a planetary scale. However, the Mad Villain's schemes were ultimately thwarted by the combined efforts of the Fantastic Four, the Black Panther, and the Inhuman Royal Family. In the end, Psycho Man escaped back to the Microverse, while his lackeys were apprehended and imprisoned. Months later, 2 of the 3, Shell Shock and Live Wire, broke out of prison and reclaimed their high-tech weapons. They later concocted a scheme to steal priceless art pieces from the blind sculptor Alicia Masters by posing as movers, but of course Masters was dating the Thing, Ben Grimm, who put the kibosh on their plans. Shell Shock later escaped from custody yet again, this time designing a new costume and rebuilding his Shock Blaster. He even succeeded in upgrading his Psycho Man-made weapon, doubling its power and preparing even more attachments for special effects and ammunition. Much like the Hijacker, Shell Shock also planned on attacking the Thing while he was in the hospital, but in this case he was driven off by Scott Lang, the second Ant-Man. Despite this setback, with his new costume and formidable weapon, Shell Shock was poised to make his mark on the world. Then he was killed by the Scourge of the Underworld without ever actually accomplishing anything, and nobody ever bothered to resurrect or even remember him, with the Shell Shock identity having gone unused ever since. Livewire, meanwhile, joined up with the Circus of Crime, and while he might not be a household name, he has popped up alongside them a few times over the years, and so between Psycho Man's 3 original minions, he seems to be doing the best. He was once swallowed by a giant snake during a conflict between the Circus of Crime and the superhuman soldier John Steele, but he apparently survived that as he was later seen during a battle with Deadpool and his mercs for money. In any event, I feel like the Circus of Crime could be a video unto itself, so maybe we'll come back to them another time. In the meantime, that's all I've got for you this week, but thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it on your favorite social media. And hey, if you got all the way to the end of the video, let me know in the comments by telling me which of these obscure supervillains you think has the most potential for a comeback. In the meantime, as always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read any of them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me. Let me give a special shout out to all of my Patreon and Ko-fi supporters, Twitch subscribers, and YouTube members who help make the channel possible. By signing up for any ongoing amount on any of these platforms, you'll get your name in these special thanks here, but Patreon is the one that helps determine what topics to get covered on the channel via monthly polls. And of course, if there's anything in particular that you want me to talk about, be sure to let me know in the comments. But that is indeed all I have for you this week, and so until next time, true believers, Excelsior!